You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. And now your footwear insiders, Matt Priest and Andy Polk.
Hey everybody, this is the Shoe In Show, the Footwear Industries podcast, where we cover all things footwear, all types of shoes, wherever they're sold, wherever they're shipped, wherever they're made, whatever's on your foot, whatever you care about, whatever you love about. That's what we cover. Right, Matt Priest?
That's what we cover, my friend. And it didn't sound like you said the word ship. It sounded like you said something else. This is a family program, so I won't mention it. But it harkens me back to the Sears I shipped my pants ad campaign. And maybe we should do one I ship my shoes and see how far that takes.
Oh my gosh. I meant ship as in a ship that sails. Thank you very much. Just to clarify for this family show. Jasmine, are you with us today? How are you?
I'm doing great. I finally got this quarantine thing down packed, so I'm feeling great.
Awesome. Well, there's one person in the whole world who's got it down, so good for you.
Exactly. Did you ship your shoes, Jasmine?
Oh my gosh.
All
right. All right. Folks, FDRA, who powers this podcast, is obviously based in Washington, D.C., and one of our primary goals is lobbying on behalf of the industry, but also it's really about education around regulatory and government affairs, helping companies navigate tax policy, regulatory policy, basically trying to help advocate for footwear consumers and footwear companies to have better rules and regulations. And part of our efforts is really around, especially this year, is around election time. And part of our goal is to help educate and get shoe workers out to the polls. But also, our goal is not to have some kind of hype fest around political campaigns or candidates or anything like that. We're very apolitical. We work across both sides of the aisle. And our job is really to tamp down the emotions and really pull back the curtain a little bit. And that's what we're going to do today. Pull back a little bit the curtain on campaigns and polling and what the election looks like, what we can forecast, and maybe what it means. So we're going to have a fun conversation. Our guest today is a great friend of mine who I've worked with in the past for many years. He's also our pollster for FDRA. That is Dr. Spencer Kimball. He is the director of polling at Emerson College. So just a little background, Emerson College Polling is one of the top one or two polling firms in the country by accuracy. So it's not by reputation, where you may know I can't even say some of these, but Quinnipiac and CNN or Fox or MSNBC. Those are polls, and we'll get into that, and Spencer can speak to some of this, but those polls are a little bit different than the way they do it, much more scientific, much more focused. So he's a real professional, and again, we're gonna try to peel back the curtain of campaigns and polling. So Spencer, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Andy, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So right off the bat, as a pollster, maybe just tell people, what do you do? And then how is polling conducted? How do we, and around that too, we'll get into it, but how is polling done so poorly in 2016 that we had a big miss at the presidential level?
I guess we'll just start there to begin.
Yeah.
So we all saw the polls in 2016. We're all projecting Clinton to varying degrees. And I think the biggest problem that we have in the industry is something that we call polling literacy. And that is the interpretation of a poll result. And you got to remember, a poll is not like the basketball game I watched last night where the Celtics won by 32 points and they won by 32 points. What it is it's a range of scores. And so when, you're watching a game, you see it as a static score, and that's how it should be. But in a poll, it's really a range of scores. And so what we're saying is, well, this person could be as high as 55. They could be as low as 44%. And it's that range that you really have to take into account as you look at these results. And where the problem comes from is the way that the media and us pollsters present this information is as a precise score. And it really shouldn't be interpreted that way. Now, when you do see a series of surveys and polls that come out that all have one candidate leading on one side or the other, Then you get into the probabilities, and that's where you have your Nate Silvers and other folks who are able to make projections based on some of that polling data. And that's kind of how the two of them work hand in hand. In 2016, what I think you see is kind of in the South and out in the western part of the country, the polling did fairly well. In the Midwest, in Pennsylvania, it underperformed. And a lot of that had to do with what I would consider turnout models. I think a lot of people looked at 2008 and 2012 with Obama as a game changer. Remember, Obama gets 70 million votes in 2008, 65 million in 2012, and the 65 million was the second most next to his so there was a huge turnout. What ended up happening is in parts of the country, I believe, the turnout actually turned back to 2004 numbers without Obama on the ticket. Look at the state of Pennsylvania. If you look at the African-American turnout, yes, it was high in Philadelphia, but not so much across the state. We look in Wisconsin, you look at Milwaukee, lower African-American turnout, same thing that we saw in Michigan. So I think that had to create a systematic bias in the polling. And unfortunately, you get 3 or 4 states leaning in the wrong direction and the Electoral College flips. A lot of people had a lot of egg on their face. A lot of omelets were being eaten.
So when you're talking about this and someone's looking at poll numbers that get put out, so you're basically saying have a critical look at it. Don't just look at one poll. Look at several different polls together to see a trend line. And for the real nerds, like some of us just like to look at the questions, right? Because I mean, sometimes polls are push polls, and you can explain a little bit about what that means, but you have to have the right sample size, you have to have the right standard deviation, you have to have the right questions, correct, to get an accurate poll.
Well, let's talk about that question, because you never want to have a question. A bad question is one that influences the answer.
Right.
And so what we learned in 2018 was we did a series of, because we had a very high number of undecided voters, we were using a follow-up question asking them if they had to decide which way that they would break. What we also experimented with is just telling people the party designation of the candidates. And what we found was that significantly lowered the undecided vote, because for a lot of people, they're just voting D or R. And so they don't know their congressperson's name, but they know the D or the R. And so as soon as you tell people who these folks are, then that undecided number comes way down. And if you look at our polling, we're usually 3-4% undecided. People say, well, how is it so low? Because we give them that information. Because if you look at the ballot, that information's on the ballot.
Right.
And so we try to mimic the ballot as close as we can. Other folks do different techniques to try to mimic in different ways. What we get to do is really experiment, study it, and try to find the best way to ask those questions.
All right, Spencer. So all that being said, 2020 election, what are some of the key races or some of the key states that you're looking at? What's the polling numbers telling you? Where's kind of the race headed from a scientific standpoint?
Well, what's exciting about 2020 is we get to actually poll more states than what we were able to do in 2016. One of the, if we get into kind of inside the weeds here of the polling industry, under the Trump administration, there's been a loosening of the TCPA, the Telephone Communication Protection Act of, I think, 1996. And essentially, we can now text message people to take surveys. Most of us who are listening or on this call, you probably have received a unsolicited text message in the last couple of years. And the reason why is that there has been this loosening. Well, we just did a poll in Montana, and we were able to just call cell phones. And from it, we had a sample of about 600 likely voters. And in that poll out in Montana, a state where the Democrats are looking to potentially pick up a Senate race with Steve Bullock, the governor who ran for president, if you recall, for essentially a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
And he's running against Steve Daines. And Daines has got strong roots in the state. We have Daines up by about 5-6 points. So Montana's a state which would be a stretch for the Democrats, but it gives us the opportunity now to poll states that you can't traditionally use auto calls in. So now we can poll every state in the country, and kind of where we're looking at is at the presidential level right now. So
Right.
Obviously a state like Pennsylvania, to me, is a keystone with 20 electoral votes. That's an important state to be looking at. Michigan, 16 electoral votes. But if you took Michigan and Pennsylvania and you switch them over to the Democrats, that still puts Trump at 270. He still becomes president. So the Democrats would have to take in that second district of Maine. Up in Maine is four electoral votes. You've got that big Senate race with Collins and Gideon, but Maine and Nebraska, they split their electoral votes. It's not winner take all, it's proportional by district. So in 2008, Obama won the second district of Nebraska for the first time, split those electoral votes. In 2016, Trump won the second district of Maine and split those electoral votes. So it's actually that second electoral vote that puts Trump over to the 270. That's one that the Democrats are going to be going for, both at the Senate race and obviously at the presidential. I also think Trump is going to be more aggressive in Minnesota. That's a state that was fairly tight in 2016 with 10 electoral votes. And he always polled well in Nevada. Don't forget, he lost the state by about 2 points, but polled better than Romney or McCain did out there. That's a state I think he'll be trying to be a little more aggressive in. Of course, he's playing defense in a lot of areas like Arizona. There you've got a big Senate race. And there's another trend that came out of 2016 was all the states that Trump won, the Republicans won the Senate races. All the states that Clinton won, the Democrats won the Senate races. So obviously there's a lot of races in the Senate that are on the board: Colorado, Iowa, North Carolina, Georgia. So those would be, Alabama. So we kind of, run around the country, but you can see a lot of states are in play, at least at this point in the cycle. But again, the Democrats have to figure out how to knock Trump down while Trump is looking what states he can hold on to, maybe expand, but he's going to have to be able to, keep to the 270 number.
Hey, Spencer, you mentioned the likely voter thing when you were talking about those two words, when you were talking about Montana. And I want to kind of dive a little bit deeper in the likely voter, just the whole concept of it. Because when I see a poll, particularly in the summer before an election, and it's a registered voter, I kind of just discard it. I don't even think about it. And then I start to see more and more likely voter models. And so why don't you talk about how do you build out as best as you can an accurate likely voter model, and then compare and contrast maybe 16 or 18 with 20, because how do you build out a likely voter model with a global pandemic and increased absentee and mail-in voting and all these other different factors that really none of us have seen in our lifetime as it relates to the impact on the electorate? So I'm really curious to educate our listeners on what likely voter means, and then how do you pivot in 2020 for likely voter?
Yeah, those are great questions, Matt. And I think you would start off with, say, defining the likely voter. And every pollster will probably give you a different definition. For example, Gallup, they'll use a series of 7 questions to determine who their likely voter is. What we look for is we ask usually 2 or 3 questions on likely voting. One having to be if they're registered to vote. Most states, you have to be registered in order to vote. North Dakota, I think, being the exception, where you kind of just show up on that election day. So that's one criteria. But then we ask them their voting intention. And as you mentioned, this year, we're asking more about how they intend to vote in person or by mail. And what's important is that what we find is when you ask a person their intention. So, for example, if I asked you guys, hey, let's just pretend we're pre-pandemic. Hey, guys, after the show, do you want to go have a beer? Well, if you gave me any hesitation in your answer, that would be an indication that you really didn't want to go have a beer. But maybe because of social norms, you'd be like, oh, maybe. But deep down, you're not hanging out with me after the program. So that hesitation tells me that you're probably not going to do that. So what we do is in our voting intention question, we say, well, how likely are you to vote? Very likely, somewhat, 50-50. And we'll eliminate everybody who is below very likely. Or as we get closer to the election, remember, early voting is going to start in almost 40 days. So people are going to already have voted. We have to ask if they've already voted and then to see those trends. Now, traditionally, the early vote breaks Democrat. And so you expect to see certain numbers in those data sets. One thing that we get to do as a pollster is we do get to differentiate between those who say they're definitely going to vote and those who say they might vote. And we get to see where those trends are. And one of the limitations that we found in 2016, where we were kicking out essentially new voters. And in 2018, we decided to leave these folks in, and it made our polling more accurate because those new voters were breaking for the Democrats. And if we had not kept them in, the polling would have been skewed towards the Republicans. And it's those, really little decisions that you have to make along the way, all those judgments that will produce quality polling. Well, and this year is no exception. As you mentioned, we have a lot of new variables in play. Not only is mail balloting going to obviously be increased, but the way voters are breaking, if you plan to vote by mail, you seem to be breaking for Biden 2 to 3 to 1. If you're voting in person, you're breaking for Trump 2 to 3 to 1. We've seen this now in 3 or 4 polls. So if this trend continues, how does that impact the race? And of course, really the polling should be used as a guide and not as, gospel. And you should be looking at it saying, oh, okay, it looks like the trends are going in this direction or in that direction. Similar to what we kind of saw in the results last time. If you think about the first state that came out was Indiana. And a lot of the polling suggested Trump would win Indiana by 10, 11 points. He ends up winning the state by like 19, 20 points. And I remember looking at those and I'm like, ooh, I kind of raised an eyebrow. I didn't expect to see that. And then you could see that kind of rising tide everywhere. Right now, you're seeing all of the races much tighter or leaning towards the Democrats than what they were in 2016 in final results. So, that would be something to pick up on.
That begs the question, maybe I can put it to you this way. Myth or fact, in 2016, there was a plethora of voters who would not publicly or heck, even privately to a pollster say they were voting for Trump and then ended up voting for him. And that was some of the discrepancy with some of the results in some of these key states. One, is that a myth or fact? And two, if it's fact, how is that a phenomenon that'll again occur in 2020? Or is there a way to get around kind of this unwillingness of some voters based maybe on stigma to say that they're voting for the president again?
Yeah, we certainly could have this would be referred to as the Bradley effect. And the Bradley effect comes out of California's election with Mayor Bradley was running for governor, an African-American mayor of Los Angeles. And he was leading in the polls. And came election day, he loses the election by a couple of points. And a lot of people said, well, you see, there was a hidden anti-black vote out there. And we've actually seen elections in New York similar in the late 80s where similar patterns emerged. And a lot of people were considering this might be the case in 2008 where Obama was leading by 6-7 points. And a lot of folks were concerned that the Bradley effect would impact that race. As we know, it didn't. I see that more as myth. And if anything, I got to think that after being elected, that the Trump voter would feel more inclined to show their support, that they were part of at least majority as far as the Electoral College goes in support of him. But those are concerns that sometimes what we have is selection bias. And so in a survey, it's difficult to get 18 to 24-year-olds. It might be difficult to get certain pockets of the population that maybe live in rural areas and are more inclined to vote in one direction or another. And that's up to the pollster, that we have to really make sure that we try to create, a representative sample and a model that based on what we've seen. And as you mentioned, this year is beyond anything that we've seen. We can kind of compare it to, other stages of U.S. history. But, it's hard. It's not an apples to apples comparison. So we don't know. Do we get an 85% turnout, or is it a 75%, 70% turnout? But that makes a huge difference because we're talking tens of thousands of people. And that's what makes up this election. A state like Montana, 10,000, 20,000 people, you switch sides. Now, all of a sudden, that's a competitive race. We look at a state like North Carolina, same thing. Let me just point out one more thing that you should be looking at for those of us who really like to follow this stuff is voter registration numbers in these states. I think that the Democrats have this aura that they are great organizers, and due to their background in labor unions and in grassroots, that they are the party of organization. But when you start to look at state by state voter registration numbers, you notice that the Republicans are doing fairly well in Florida. They're doing well in North Carolina. They're doing well in Nevada. Now, Democrats are doing better in Georgia. They're doing better in Arizona, but you kind of have to look at it on a state by state basis because there is a shifting ground that's happening. Remember, there's going to be a redistricting that's going to occur. Florida is going to pick up 3 congressional seats. Texas is going to pick up 3 congressional seats. Those people didn't just show up overnight. They have been growing in these populations. Who are these populations, and how is that going to impact the election? Those are all things that us pollsters are thinking about as we put together those models and see, okay, this is how it voted in 2016, 18. Can we find some sort of trajectory that we can, or, do we get egg on our face November 4th? Obviously, the election's on the 3rd, but the day after, though this year it might take us a week or two.
Might take a longer time, yeah. And I'll jump in here too because I want to echo what Spencer was saying about the margins in these elections in these states. We saw Michigan razor thin margin the last time, razor thin margins in Pennsylvania. When it was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. So you're talking 1, 2, 3 votes per precinct across the state. It reminds me either of Kennedy's elections or even George W. Bush's election down in Florida, where you have 1 or 2 votes per precinct switching the election, maybe even less than that. So we do want to behoove people as we talk about this and focus on the election. FDRA has created a voter resource center for shoe workers. It's called shoevoter.com. So I'll say it again, shoevoter.com. It's very easy. Type it in, Google it. It's a nonpartisan. It's apolitical. You go into the site, you choose your state, you type in your address. We're not capturing any information off of this. We simply allow you to type it in, and you can find your state's information on how to register, as well as how to apply for absentee ballots, where to vote on voting day if you want to go in person, what you might need, ID requirements, etc. It's all there, shoevoter.com. And right now, I encourage people to register. I encourage you, if you're not comfortable going to a poll on election day, to apply for an absentee. I'll eliminate the stigma of it myself. I've voted most of the time during my adult life as absentee voter, working in Congress, voting back in North Carolina, where I'm from, because of reciprocity rules. So I could not make it down perhaps on election day, and I would vote by absentee ballot. And there is no issues with that. It's perfectly safe. There's a system for that to receive it. There's witnesses you have to have signed. And I guess that's the other thing too, is I want to encourage people, if you are applying for an absentee ballot and you get it, make sure you sign it. Make sure you follow the rules. If you need witnesses to sign it, make sure you have them sign it. Do not merely submit it without reading the rules, because it will not be submitted and it will not count if it's not signed and following the guidelines. So there is a bureaucracy to voting. It's not complicated, but there is some complexity to it. And I just want to make that plug really quickly. Spencer, before we switch it over to Jasmine for her world famous fashion and footwear focus segment, I want your brain to switch a little bit from pollster to political science professor, because I know you also teach political science and political communications at Emerson College in Boston. I want to get your take. You were talking a little bit about, whether someone votes absentee or someone votes in person. I think what's really interesting too in this election is the retail politics. And I know you teach this to your students. So maybe you can share some insights on how you see this going, because obviously President Trump is someone who feeds off crowds. It's, the campaigns are a little hesitant maybe to go door to door, although we have seen numbers come out, and we don't know if they're accurate or not, but the Trump campaign says they're knocking on 1 million doors a week at this point in the key states. How do you see the campaigns playing this out? Is this going to, obviously digital ads are huge, but what's going to make a difference in this election? Knocking on a door, a digital ad, what's the campaign strategy for COVID?
Well, that you raise a lot of interesting questions, and unfortunately, I'm the pollster, so I get to ask the questions. Don't normally have all the answers,
right?
But if I think about it, you've got the presidential race, and everyone's focused on that. But remember, we got like 30,000 races down ballot.
Right.
What it's interesting, and I've seen some of the candidates down the ballot. They've used Zoom and other video conferencing technologies to essentially go into people's living rooms. So the television was, kind of the living room candidate for a long time, for 50, 60, 70 years. It was the television ad. Now we are getting more accustomed to these Zooms, and where candidates now, and you got to remember, you can tell a lot about a person when you look in their house, where their video is. Is it in their bedroom? Is it in their, is there pictures of the kids? You can really start to create relationships. Now, what happens is as you move up those electoral ladders to higher office, you have less connection to the voters. And so when we think about the presidential level, there's no way Joe Biden or Donald Trump is going to be able to hold, Zoom chats with thousands of people. But we are going to be living in a digital age. And so to me, this is where the campaigns, what we've seen a big difference between 2012 and 2016 is in texting and people using cell phone technology to contact folks. Now, what we're going to see is just in my opinion, some sort of massive move to online organization, basically taking what John McCain and Howard Dean were able to do at the beginning of the century and move it into the 21st century of campaigning, where more digital, more online organizing, unfortunately more tribal in the way that people are going to connect with each other in certain groups that maybe in the long run limits their marketplace of ideas. And, that's something that politicians need to consider as we live in a very partisan era. And if we want to actually bring folks together, maybe we have to knock down not just the physical walls, but these digital barriers that keep people isolated in those groups, and kind of cements those and crystallizes those opinions. So I think you got to look at it from a societal standpoint of what's happening. And remember, it's not just happening to me and you. This is happening to our children. So their futures are going to be much more digital than what we grew up with. And we got to be considering that because, God willing, there will be a 2024 election, a 2028. The way I see it is we held an election in 1864 in the middle of a civil war, and we're able to move the country forward. And so we'll be able to handle this pandemic and only use it in the future for, other forms of communication and hopefully increase, as you were saying, to get out and vote, participation in our democratic process.
Yeah, Spencer, one of the things I want to kind of bring in that comment you just made and then revert back to something you said earlier about the in-person voting breaking toward the Republican side and the mail-in voting or absentee ballot voting breaking towards Joe Biden in really significant margins. And it dawns on me, and you probably see this all the time, and just thinking about how the president himself has been very publicly kind of talking down mail-in voting, wanting to have in-person voting. We had the whole week kerfluffle, if you will, when he said maybe we should delay it or that maybe we should speed up the election. And so everyone kind of went crazy, including the Republican Party. But you can see now that I've heard kind of where the polling is around those two different avenues, and maybe that speaks to that tribalism you just talked about, but it's clear to me why now the president is saying these things, because he's really nervous about those margins. And so as a pollster, can you sit there and pretty accurately predict how politicians will react just based on some of the polling dynamics that you're seeing? Because this seems like the perfect example as to now why the president is out there saying what he's saying.
Yeah, I'll give you an example exactly. It was 2016. And if you remember, John McCain was endorsing Donald Trump that entire election, right? Even though Trump called him, whatever he called him back in June of 2015, he wasn't a hero. You remember all of that. But McCain, to his credit, or to the party, was loyal to Trump until, if you recall, it was about October. And you say, hey, Spence, why does McCain pull his endorsement from Trump? It was because of this. He could have pulled his endorsement for a variety of reasons. Why does he wait till that moment? Well, we were polling that Arizona race. And that race, what he was running in, was within maybe 6-7 points. All of a sudden, at the end of September, early October, his numbers jumped to double digits. And literally that next day, he pulls his endorsement because he knew he was safe enough to get reelected. The polling showed him. And so it allows people to do things that they might not otherwise do because, in my opinion, and mine's not alone, the goal of a politician is to get reelected. And so
don't say.
If that is true, and that is conventional wisdom, then that's how I look at these events. And I see, okay, this candidate's going to have to toe the line here because, yes, they don't want to, but they need to get reelected. Right. And we see that a lot. You can see that in the messaging. You can see that in policies. So like even on the George Floyd investigation, if you recall, that police officer was first charged or wasn't going to be charged. And then what was he going to be charged with? Well, we did a survey and it showed that people wanted it, to a very high degree of homicide and essentially we watched as the Minnesota, the Attorney General increased the severity of the crime. And I'm like, this kind of just matches the public opinion.
Right.
And so you don't know what comes first, chicken or the egg, but you can tell there's some connection between the two.
Yeah. And I think having worked in the political space, Andy and I go back almost 20 years in the political space. There's this kind of notion that politicians are wishy-washy and they're reactive and they base everything on polling. And then you kind of realize that often it's just a reflection of the wishy-washy nature of the American electorate and as a reflection of that. Well, I will say 100% of the results are in, and it's a unanimous. Jasmine Pendergrass is our key fashion footwear expert. And so I want to bring Jasmine in because one of the things that Jasmine does is bring in a trend. We don't know what it is. She drops it on us, and then we have to react from our perspective of whether or not we think it's the greatest trend ever, or if it's a lead balloon. And Andy and I are not the most trend-worthy guys, so this should be interesting. And we encourage you to jump in as you see fit as well. So, Jasmine, the floor is yours, my friend.
Well, thank you guys and the people for electing me as your fashion guide. I have been on a rabbit hole of sustainable shoes since I've kind of gotten my quarantine process down pat, because it's like, what else is out there now? It's not the normal trends that I usually see throughout the year. Things have slowed down, especially in the heel business. I haven't heard much news on women's heels, just a lot of sneakers and outdoor shoes and things like that. So I'm like, okay, what's new in sustainability? But then I went back because although there's not a ton of new items, even though there are, ASICS had a virtual innovation summit recently. So there are still items being produced and innovation happening, but I went backwards and was like, well, what did I miss? So I seen that there was a shoe that was made out of mushrooms. And of course, I'm familiar with, coffee shoes and Reeboks and using corn and I don't know, there's so many different things, but I thought, wow, I don't know how you're going to market a mushroom shoe. I mean, it's like fungus. I think it's interesting that somebody just was bold enough to do that. So I was wondering, did you guys try those shoes? It's a brown shoe. It's a shoe that you could wear with multiple items. But if it seemed fashionable enough, would you, swipe your card for a pair of mushroom shoes?
Oh my gosh. Maybe if I'm on shrooms, I might just buy some mushroom shoes. I don't know. I mean, Spencer, what do you think? Or is that something that'd be in your repertoire of shoe purchases?
No, but I will say, I'm pretty conservative in my shoe choice, but I've seen in some areas that type of style. I remember once seeing a gorilla shoe, and I thought it was only to find out that the shoe was 4 times the cost of my shoes. So, what it looks like.
A little bit. I mean, was there gorillas on it? Was it made out of their skin? Like, what is that?
It looked like a gorilla. It looked like, I thought it was like a slipper, but it was actually the sneakers. It was an interesting design, but different neighborhoods, they have different styles.
Yeah, I don't think I'm swiping my card for it, but I definitely thought it was interesting. I also seen like Hugo Boss had like a shoe made from pineapple leaf fibers, which I thought was really interesting, but those are really nice. So it's just interesting how like pineapples are good. You think, they smell good, they taste good. When I think mushrooms, although I love mushrooms, it's like, do I want to wear them on my feet? I don't know. So good luck with that. But I thought that was interesting. I wanted to get you guys' feedback on how, like, would somebody actually purchase it?
Does it come like sauteed with a baked potato and a steak? Is there like a package deal?
Sauteed in the bag, yeah.
I'd consider it, honestly. No, I think with sustainability, and obviously we have a whole sustainability summit digitally coming up to talk about some of these things. But I think it's interesting to see people play around with different things. But ultimately, consumer is going to look at the value play, and that's going to say, is it comfortable? Do I really care if it's mushroom or not? I want a shoe that's sustainably made, that's eco conscious, that reduces our impact on the environment, but it's got to be comfortable. I've got to get value. It's got to be durable. It's got to be breathable. And that really is a question of some of these materials coming out. How breathable are these things? How flexible are they? Do they expand? I mean, I think one big thing right now, obviously in COVID, is athletic shoes and the Flyknit. And it's because it's extremely comfortable. It's just from a traditional athletic shoe where you have a lot of stitching and you have a lot of structure to it. Here's a shoe that's just basically a knitted upper that's put on a shoe. And there's that value play of just complete comfort. And in the same way around sustainability, we can try different stuff, but ultimately it's less about the material itself and just about the value it provides to the consumer. So it's a mix, I think. For me, I'm not being sold on the mushroom alone, but I like the idea of the stories around process reduction or material reduction, things like that.
Well, I totally agree. And you hit the nail on the head, and having a pollster in this conversation is it's an opportunity for me, because I often say on sustainability and even made in America that these are concepts that poll really well. If you call someone up, say, hey, do you want a shoe that's made in an American factory, or do you want a shoe that's sustainable and environmentally friendly? All of us to a T would say absolutely. But the moment that shoe doesn't perform well, or it's ugly, or doesn't breathe, as you said, Andy, or the value's not there, then people aren't going to buy it. And so we have this disconnect between polling and purchasing behavior. And I don't know how you solve that with poll questions, because I'm no expert, but it's one of those things I think polls well, but in actuality, it doesn't play out in the marketplace.
Yeah, Matt, let me jump on that for a moment, because that's like the seminal case in attitudes versus actions. And it comes back to us from a study back in the 1920s with Professor Lapierre, who took an Asian couple around the country to see if people would be racist towards allowing them to stay at their hotels and restaurants. And what they found was a disconnect, that they were racist, but they wanted the money. And so attitudes and actions didn't necessarily connect. And this is fundamental principle 100 years later, if we think about it. There's always this disconnect between, kind of the rational, logical approach and what people decide to do. Attitudes, don't necessarily correlate with your behavior. And that's why we ask how they're going to vote, but then we ask other questions of them. But if we think about, like the cigarette industry, what got people to stop smoking cigarettes was not the Surgeon General's warning. It wasn't polling. It wasn't, public service announcements. It was generally the cost. As the cost increased. And I think if you look at, as you're talking about sustainability of the footwear industry, what's the cost? And yes, we want to buy American. Yes, we want to do these things. But as soon as you go to the store and you see a pair of shoes for $39 versus $99, most people, it's because of a budget, are going to go to the $39 shoe. And that's the reality. So those are things that you have to always keep in mind from the corporate side, that yes, you want to make sure you're doing good for, society, but you also have to have a bottom line. And that's where the rub usually comes in.
Yeah, well said. I mean, you've thrown out surveys from the 1920s. You've thrown out apparently you've gotten
smarter. What did I get to do? I study this.
You've gotten smarter during COVID, I think, than in years past when we used to interact. So good for you. And I know
it's only 11 in the morning.
I know Emerson's happy to have you there. And obviously you built the polling program up, and being one or two nationally is something that we're proud of you and proud that you're our pollster when we do surveys of shoe consumers. Before I wrap up the show, I do want to know just one thing really quickly. What's your bellwether state? One or two states they're going to be the decider for the 2020 election. What states do you think?
I'm looking at Pennsylvania. I think that one as one of Biden's home states, a state that Trump carried, that will be a bellwether of sorts. And I think Arizona. Arizona is a state that, has really grown in Hispanic population. We'll have to see if the Democrats can actually get out that vote. They typically break for the Democrats. So those would be the two that I would keep my eyes on across the country. But there's lots of, there's lots of good races down the East Coast, even Texas. There's a reason why 7 Republican Congress members retired. No right. Democrats. Why did they? It wasn't to give other people an opportunity. They see something coming in Texas. So right. We have to keep an eye out. If not this year, I don't know if Cornyn's going to have trouble with Hager in that Senate race, but certainly the population is shifting. And same thing in the Midwest, the population shifting. So you'll never get a short answer out of me.
There you go. That's all right.
But I sure enjoy the conversation.
The answer was Pennsylvania.
I've turned into a senator over the years.
Oh, my God. All right, Spencer, man, I really appreciate you coming on today. Appreciate your insights. Folks, I hope you've gotten something really interesting about this today. Again, it's not a traditional conversation that you're going to see on CNN, MSNBC, or Fox, or PBS, or the nightly news. We really try to go... we really try to educate. We really try to stay away from any emotional things. We really try to be apolitical. And so I think it's always really interesting because I think polling is fundamental to our society of understanding shifts and changes. And we need to understand what polls are good, what polls we can trust, how we look at trend lines. So we really want to thank Spencer for coming on today. Folks, we're on every single audio platform known to man, from Spotify to iTunes. If you don't have any of these things, you can just go to shoeandshow.com and listen to us on our website. Please rate us. Please contact us if you have
5 stars
or ideas. Only 5 stars. We're just like Uber. You don't give less than 5. Everybody knows that. Social norm. But I do want to encourage everybody as I wrap up. Please register. Please vote. Don't care how you vote. Care that you vote. Go to shoevoter.com to get all the information you need for your local jurisdiction. Get information on how you apply for an absentee, or if you're going to vote in person, make sure you understand your ID requirements or any requirements to vote in person. Extremely important. Again, I'm liking it to the DMV. It's not complicated, but it can be complex. There is a bureaucracy to voting, so make sure you do it correctly and make sure the vote counts. On behalf of Matt and Jasmine, we want to thank you guys for continuing listening to us. Last month in July, we passed 10,000 in 1 month alone. It's a huge uptick, and we really appreciate your listenership and really appreciate all the engagement we have from all our many members and other shoe workers across the industry. Please be safe. Please be healthy. Please go vote. Thank you.
Shoe-In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.